Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Nash. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. And that's all I have to say. No, thank you. No, thank you. I'm the director of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies here at Duke University. It is my immense honor to welcome you all to the 17th Annual Feminist Theory Workshop. For 17 years, FTW has hosted leading feminist scholars, including Hortense Spillers, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Lauren Berlant, Donna Haraway, Elizabeth Povinelli, Patricia J. Williams, Catherine McKittrick, and Christina Crosby. This year, we welcome Grace Hong, Julie Livingston, Jasbir Puar, and Kevin Quashie, and our roundtable participants Heather Berg, Rana Jalil, Emily Owens, and Robin Weekman. From its inception, this gathering has always been a workshop, a space for thinking across fields and institutions, across disciplines and methods. It has been a place where the complexities of feminist theories are debated and discussed, where breakout rooms allow participants to voice their questions and ideas, and where students and faculty collectively engage and at times collectively struggle with feminist and queer theories. And here I want to thank Robin Weekman for her vision in creating Feminist Theory Workshop. In 2021, FTW became a fully hybrid event, and the virtual FTW has allowed more scholars from across the world to access the event while maintaining the workshop format and creating online spaces for scholarly exchange and debate. So I also want to extend a warm welcome to those who are accessing FTW online right now. And I want to encourage us all to use the Twitter or whatever it's called, hashtag FTW 2024, as a way of building bridges between conversations happening in this room and those unfolding online. The duration of this event, 17 years, is evidence of the ongoing demand for contending with the tender and at times fraught places where feminist theories converge with other theoretical projects in queer studies, Black studies, critical ethnic studies, and traditional disciplines. And of course, it is evidence of the urgent need for a space to analyze the multiple intersecting and overlapping catastrophes that mark the present through feminist theoretical lenses. We inhabit a moment marked by conditions those of us in this room know far too well, and I'll just lay out a few of them. Critical race theory and intersectionality have become weaponized terms, taken up largely in unrecognizable forms by the right. They are now deployed as evidence of the saturation of college campuses by a demand for left ideological conformity, or what is often simply called wokeism. Concerted efforts to ban teaching about what the Alabama state legislature this week called divisive concepts like race, gender, and sexuality has marked our field, at least for those on the right, as a space for indoctrination rather than critical thought. The New College of Florida, a public liberal arts college in Sarasota, made front page news last year when Governor Ron DeSantis worked to transform it into what he called a beacon of conservatism, an effort that included abolishing gender studies, which he described as an ideological movement rather than an academic discipline. The policing of knowledge, the banning of concepts and theories, the erosion of tenure and academic freedom, the curtailment of critical inquiry, the rewriting of history, and the insistence that educators, in the words of a South Carolina law, refrain from teaching anything that can cause discomfort, guilt, or anguish on the basis of political belief, all unfold alongside the dismantling of affirmative action in college admissions and the elimination of the incredibly short-lived institutional project of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is abundantly clear that the university is the battleground where fights about intellectual liberty, free expression, truth in a post-truth era, and critical thought will continue to be waged, and that gender and sexuality studies, alongside race and ethnic studies, will be at the very heart of those battles. I confess I am exhausted by the news. Perhaps you are too. These days, I often return to the opening pages of The Alchemy of Race and Rights, which I do admit is my favorite book, so I return to it a lot, where Patricia J. Williams tells us that she can't bear to confront the brutality of the world anymore. When we first meet her in the opening pages of her book, she is, in her words, very depressed. She is wearing an old terry bathrobe. She is overwhelmed by how, as she says, conditions are bad, very bad, all over the world. And she tells her readers that she, quote, doesn't know how to find something to write about in the panic of this deadly world. There is more in the news than even my depression can consume. But Williams tells us she writes from this position, theorizes from it, since the conditions of the deadly world require that she, and I think she would argue we also, invent and proliferate new genres and forms of theory. She tells us that a willingness to forge new theoretical grammars is how to move towards what she calls a jurisprudence of generosity and a deeper understanding of the multiple forms of violence that mark the everyday, including the harms to the spirit that she argues are so prevalent as to be wholly invisible. It is theoretical inventiveness, it is rigorous, creative, in her words, alchemical theorizing that can help us get at what Williams argues is a fundamental and often elided point. And I quote her that life is complicated is a fact of great analytic importance. A simple and abundant claim that sociologist Avery Gordon, in her equally brilliant Ghostly Matters, calls, quote, perhaps the most important theoretical statement of our time. So often, theory has been and still is talked about as in friction with something called practice or politics or praxis or real life. And while this debate is not one that I'm invested in, if I'm honest, I am interested in the hold it continues to have over feminist psychic lives, particularly in a moment where so much of feminist theorizing happens on Instagram and TikTok by influencers on Twitter and in best selling trade books like Mickey Kendall's Hood Feminism or Tressie Cottom's Thick. Feminist theorists have long grappled with the utility of theory in the time of urgency. We've worked to craft theories that are, in Adrienne Rich's words, good to the earth. You can track this preoccupation in so many of our foundational texts, in Adrienne Rich's plea for radical specificity as a feminist ethic and responsibility, or in Barbara Christian's insistence that abstraction can be a technology of violence, that we need to move from what she calls capital T theory to an embrace of theorizing in its multiple forms, or in Christina Sharp's call for becoming undisciplined as a necessary project for Black thought. I'm reminded of a set of off-cited questions E. Patrick Johnson posed in his now 25-year-old co-edited volume Black Queer Studies. Johnson asked, and I quote him, what is the utility of queer theory on the front lines, in the trenches, on the street, or any place where the racialized and sexualized body is beaten, starved, fired, cursed, indeed when the body is the site of trauma? For Johnson, the answer to that question is Black Queer Studies, or for those who've read the essay Queer Studies, which is about what he calls theory and practice, the lettered and unlettered, ivory tower and front porch, and that speaks from and to home place, to think with bell hooks. My own interest is for us to insist on an embrace of a kind of feminist theoretical pluralism. Rather than continuing to rehearse the divides that we have all heard, theory practice, theory politics, theory praxis, it seems to me urgent that we reinvest in feminist theory's multiple and even contradictory forms, genres, modes, methods, and commitments. I admit I started on a depressing note with this talk by mapping the precarity of gender and sexuality studies and the organized and concerted effort to eradicate the work that many of us are deeply invested in. But that isn't the entirety of the story of the moment that we're in. Myriad gender and sexuality studies departments and programs across the US have hosted celebrations of their 50th or 40th anniversaries. Many more are scheduled for this coming year. The scholarly journals Feminist Studies and Signs both celebrated their 50th anniversaries. I think Signs conference was just last week. Congratulations to them. Marking the importance of scholarly publishing venues dedicated to gender and sexuality studies to the vitality of the field. Our own program, GSF at Duke, celebrated its 40th anniversary in 2023 with a series of events devoted to the feminist 1970s. The proliferation of anniversaries, commemorations, and celebrations is evidence of the fact that we have indeed forged institutional homes, fought and won space in the university, even as that space is allocated, inhabited, and felt differently across institutions, across the public private binary, across the US and globally. And it is no doubt our institutionalization, admittedly uneven, ambivalent, and complex, that has generated much of the ire that emerges from the right. My brief outline of the political conditions of the present gestures to some of the contradictions that mark contemporary academic feminism. We are comfortably or uncomfortably institutionalized and we are under attack. We are precarious and we wield power. We are at home in the institution and we are never at home in the institution. We often develop turns of phrases like in but not of the university. Here I nod to my class because I think this came up just this week, to mark our desires to separate ourselves and our seemingly insurgent knowledge projects from the institutions that house us or professionalize us or offer us some temporary shelter or at the least offer us access to JSTOR. Feminist theories in the plural are essential for helping us think through these contradictions. Feminist theories can help us, for example, think through a moment where myriad scholars writing in and around critical university studies call for something amorphously called abolish the university, and where the right seeks nothing more than the eradication of the very knowledge projects we are committed to. Feminist theories in the plural help us think about how we actually need to invest in what we labor to make rather than retreat from it, even as it is also a fraught and complicated, broken, and at times violent space. When I say feminist theories are essential to helping us think through the moment we're in, I don't mean it in a prescriptive way. I don't think feminist theories pose an answer or even a set of answers to the catastrophes that I outlined, nor to the complexities of institutional life. Instead, I think feminist theories offer us ways of posing questions and a set of tools for continuing to think. Feminist theories also allow us to begin to voice questions we don't yet know how to articulate. This is important to me, at least, because I am so struck by the contemporary desire for a feminism that can offer us a single diagnosis of the present moment and a clear pathway to what Keonga Taylor has called getting free. I'm troubled by the increasingly pervasive notion that if we adhere to a doctrine, that if we orient our lives towards, say, intersectionality or abolition, we'll find something that we might call freedom. One of the challenges of the present moment, I think, is not just to refuse the forces that have marked our work as dangerous, but also to refuse the lure of a feminist orthodoxy that prescribes any singular mode of feminist analysis or politics as ethically correct, as morally superior, or as deserving of our total obedience. I will say that theoretical orthodoxy has its own dangers, and it seems to me we should be mindful of them. I find myself increasingly interested in what it would mean to sit with a body of feminist theories that point us only towards uncertainty and that embrace, rather than reject, ambivalence as a feminist affect and ethic that is constitutive of feminist political life. Here, I find myself again returning to Anne Snitto's Feminism of Uncertainty from 2015 and to her title essay, which champions uncertainty, telling readers, in her words, embracing uncertainty since I can never get far beyond it is both my temperament and the political aesthetic I can still sustain without tasting ashes. She goes on to say that uncertainty is a powerful, quote, counterweight to various forms of rigidity, false closures, or too perfect dreams of unity or order. And she continues, I want to guard here at the close against any mapping of uncertainty onto a blithe disregard for the responsibility to shape one's feminist projects. Uncertainty, as I figure it here, is very far from anything goes, she says. On the contrary, it puts extra stress on the need to define, in each situation, what one is doing. A feminism of uncertainty calls us to sit in the place of not knowing, to hold contradictions, to mark what we don't yet know, to affirm ambivalence. It is a refusal of both capture and resolution, and an insistence that we can, indeed should, hold multiple and even competing feminist perspectives simultaneously. There are so many models for a feminism of uncertainty in the feminist theoretical archive. Just a few weeks ago, I was rereading Cherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldua's classic, This Bridge Called My Back, a text which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Bridge, of course, is part of the golden age of the feminist anthology. The anthology, Bridge, Homegirl, Some of Us Are Brave, and others, became probably the primary vehicle through which women of color feminism and third world feminism entered what was then called the women's studies classroom. And it was a form that lent itself to pluralism and multivocality. But what struck me so deeply when I read Bridge this time is how essays, poems, and manifestos that sit side by side diverge and disagree about nearly everything: separatism, the meaning of race, coalition, the politics of difference, to name just a few. These pieces sit next to each other uneasily, and nothing about the editorial project of the book seeks to ameliorate those divergences. It is a volume that doesn't just tolerate disagreement, but welcomes it, insisting that multiplicity is constitutive of women of color feminist practice. This, I should say, is ironic since in the decades that followed, much of the women's studies classroom would reduce women of color feminist theory entirely to intersectionality, but that's another story. There's something about Bridges' refusal to tidy radical disagreements or to paper over tensions that can feel jarring to a contemporary reader. Reading Bridge now again, I realize that we have arrived in a moment that so often craves resolution and finality. And revisiting it made me ask how we might cultivate space for deep feminist divergences and treat those divergences as a sign of the vitality of feminism's theoretical projects in the plural. No theoretical tradition has taught me more about pluralism and multiplicity than Black feminisms and women of color feminisms. From Deborah King's work on multiple jeopardy, to Gloria Anzaldua's work on mestizaje, to Mari Matsuda's work on multiple consciousness as a jurisprudential method, to Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality as a juridical project that can redress multiple and overlapping forms of harm. For me, reading and rereading Black feminist theory, or what I've started to call living with Black feminist theory, has been a training in building theoretical frameworks that privilege multiplicity and messiness over singularity and coherence. It's a body of work that has encouraged me to build intellectual habits of cultivating rather than resisting uncertainty. And that is where this workshop comes in. The Feminist Theory Workshop has persisted, even as we, those of us in this room and those online, have vastly different attachments to our shared object, feminist theory. As I mentioned, we come to this space from our vastly distinct disciplinary and interdisciplinary locations, all of which have their own relationships to feminist theories, methods, and approaches. This means that we can assume no common language or shared approach, and that instead we must take care, and here I'm following Snitto, to unpack the words we use, to take the time to figure out how to say what it is we mean, and to mark that we might not yet know what it is that we want to say. I started by celebrating the fact that we've kept this workshop going, sustained it for 17 years. And I should say, I don't mean to be romantic about institutions or, or about elite private institutions specifically, even as I think that there is something particularly democratic about this space, no cost to register, live streaming, a virtual platform, and a fully accessible and quite amazing archive of every talk that's ever happened here on YouTube. There is no doubt that after 17 years, this workshop is an institutionalized feminist practice. And as my remarks indicate, I'm interested in what it means to produce what has been marked or described as outsider knowledge in the comfortable and also uncomfortable space of the university. I'm interested in how feminist theories can help me and us navigate the contradictory places we find ourselves in, what it means to find home in an institution or to want a home there, what it means to forge feminist collectivity in Penn Pavilion at Duke, what it means to talk feminist theories over the swanky reception, which will follow the second talk today, and with what it means that the university, after all these decades, continues to be such an important object for feminist inquiry. My hope is that our workshop this year can hold space for all of this delicious complexity and paradox, that we can embrace not yet knowing as a feminist ethic that we are moving towards, and that we will all keep coming back year in and year out to take part in this process of thinking together. So I want to conclude with a couple of requests and then some really important notes of gratitude. So the requests are twofold. One is that, as you can tell, we have a very full room and many folks will want to ask questions after talks. Our moderators will do their very best to get in as many questions as possible. I ask that you offer your patience as we navigate this full room and the time required to move the microphones around to those who are asking questions. I also ask that you ensure that you're wearing your badge. You will need it to get in and out of Penn Pavilion at all times this weekend. And if you didn't pick up your badge, please do so at the front. And I want to conclude with some essential notes of gratitude. It takes a lot of work to sustain an event of this scale each year. So I want to thank the GSF directors before me, Robin Wiegman, Rajana Khanna, Priscilla Wald, and Jolie Alcott, all of whom have played a tremendous role in the vitality of this gathering and who had the vision and the energy to keep it going year in and year out. And I want to, oh, yes. Yes. You can find the long list of FTW co-sponsors on your program or through the QR code. And so I want to thank in brief the many departments and programs here at Duke and at other institutions that have long been supporters and friends of the Feminist Theory Workshop. And I particularly want to thank the Trinity College Dean's Office and Trinity Communications for their support. Everything you see in this room seems effortless, but it's actually the result of the tremendous effort of GSF's all-star staff. So I want to thank, standing in the back, Julie Winmore, Jeremy Boomhaller, and Amanda Archambault. I will say that every detail, big and small, is something that they have thought about. And so thank you for making these 2 days go so smoothly. I also want to thank Lauren Henschel, who's in the back with a camera, for her point guard sensibility. There always has to be one basketball reference. It is March. So for for her point guard sensibility and for all of her work on video promotion, virtual FTW, and so much more. And I want to thank all of the folks working in the room today, Tanya Rispoli in the back for her work on the virtual side of FTW, GSF's amazing student workers who've offered essential support all year, and particularly during FTW. So I want to thank Charlotte Joyner, Jen Gobera, and Bhavika Sharma. And I want to thank the volunteers who've lent their time and efforts to make the workshop run smoothly. Tessa Bolsovar, R. Morris Levine, Barbara Halla, James Ndugu, Katie Martin Brown, Barbara Ofusu Samwa, Colleen DeVille, and Marin Garner. And finally, I want to thank the core faculty of GSF at Duke. FTW is truly a team effort, and it requires the time and energy and commitment of our entire faculty. So I want to thank my colleagues, Frances Hasso, Kimberly Lamb, Nikki Lane, Gabe Rosenberg, Anna Storty, and Aura Wilson, and say that it is a pleasure to be in intellectual community with you. And now, it is my joy to say, let's begin. I would like to turn over the podium to my colleague, Anna Storty.
I was trying to make sense of what seemed to me the ubiquity of death. So begins Grace Kyungwon Hong in the epilogue of her award-winning monograph, Death Beyond Disavowal, The Impossible Politics of Difference. Published in 2015 by the University of Minnesota Press and winner of the Best Book Award in the Humanities and Cultural Studies from the Association for Asian American Studies, Death Beyond Disavowal makes no compromises, as it carries on a tradition of feminist analysis that does not take the ubiquity of death lightly. The text turns to the site of culture to observe, on the one hand, the varied and uneven exposure to violence, precarity, and loss that differentially affect all of us, and on the other, the modes of resistance that endure despite the shifting forms of capitalism and racism. Uncompromising, unwavering, these are features of Professor Hong's scholarship at large. They also signal an enduring lesson for those of us who view feminist theory as much more than a research interest, much more than a luxury or a set of readings to master, but an answer to a call set forth by those who came and died before us, a willingness, in other words, to be haunted by our dead. Professor of Gender Studies and Asian American Studies at UCLA, Grace Hong is also the director of UCLA Center for the Study of Women, also known as the Streisand Center, or in addition to the Streisand Center. She earned her PhD in literature at UC San Diego and her MA in Asian American Studies at UCLA. A key figure in women of color feminism, comparative and relational studies of racialization and political economy, Professor Hong's scholarship offers the kind of critique of neoliberalism that is not disillusioned by Western liberalism and its promises of protection, security, and personhood. Studying contemporary neoliberalism as a structure that demands disavowal, the claim that gendered and racialized violence is a thing of the past, Hong does not view this disavowal to be inevitable. Instead, she grapples with the ways disavowal rises to the surface, how it is refused, and how it is worked against. Attuned to that which has been forcibly erased, obscured, or willfully disregarded, Hong forwards a model of feminist scholarship that doesn't simply keep women of color feminism at the center, but wrestles with an orientation to the work that we're not all so quick to embrace, but I think Jen Nash actually encouraged us to embrace, which is deferring resolution. By keeping the political, epistemological, and ontological dimensions of our work in the temporality of suspension, as she describes it, Hong poses what she names an ethical question, a question of reckoning. How do we attend to the relationship between our lives and others' deaths? This question is a question that is, as evidenced by the times, never not for our times. How do we attend to the relationship between our lives and others' deaths? One may catch a glimmer of solidarity in this question. I see a kind of insurgent intimacy too, one unconvinced by the separation marking one's life from another's death. One may also note resonances between this question and the words that fill the pages of Hong's pre-circulated reading, Eve Tuck and C. Ree's A Glossary of Haunting, a co-authored experiment in argumentation, where the argument is for attending to settler colonialism in its quotidian manifestations. This all transpires in the form of a glossary about justice, about, as the authors describe, righting and also sometimes wronging wrongs, about hauntings, mercy, monsters. So, how do we, as feminists, attend to the relationship between our lives and others' deaths? Hong began the acknowledgments of death beyond disavowal with the following words: "This book exists because I felt called by the dead, and I felt that I had to acknowledge those who died as a way of reckoning with, to quote Audre Lorde, the deaths we are expected to live. I think about those whom I have been asked to disinherit in order to exist as I do, and this book is my way of acknowledging them." In her first monograph, The Ruptures of American Capital, Women of Color Feminism and the Culture of Immigrant Labor, published by Minnesota in 2006, one sees that Hong has been long grappling with death-dealing logics, including America's fetishization with individualism and difference. Women of color feminism and the cultures of women's immigrant labor in particular became the representative case study for demonstrating the dangers much more sinister than complicity, that emerge from economic incorporation and national inclusion. Capitalism is seductive, tempting us with the ruse of universal rights like the right to own property. But these forms of capital, as Hong shows, have long been understood as repressive by women of color feminism. Her critique of universality helped to bring sustained attention to the concept of incorporation. Who has been incorporated into American capitalism and why? This in turn has opened up new ways to mine the cultural and political terrain of race, gender, and sexuality. The contested modes of being incorporated come across in her collaborative work, most notably with her work with Roderick Ferguson, a speaker who graced the stage at last year's workshop. Together, they co-edited the Difference Incorporated book series at the University of Minnesota Press, and they also co-edited Strange Affinities, The Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization, published by Duke Press in 2011. Critical ethnic studies at its most critical and pedagogical, Strange Affinities is required reading for thinkers and organizers who work towards coalitional politics. Their co-authored introduction is always on the syllabus for my race, gender, and sexuality seminar. And while I don't have the time to list all of her publications, awards, and honors, you should know that Professor Hong has earned distinguished mentoring awards, teaching prizes, and an assortment of faculty research grants, including one where she is co-PI with the UC Sentencing Project, a research and policy collaboration between UC faculty, staff, and students, and currently and formerly incarcerated organizers. Most recently, she has been working on a project on situating Asian and Asian diasporic feminism within a genealogy of third world feminism. So just as I began this introduction with the book's epilogue, I wanted to end by returning to that ending once more. There, Hong wrote, quote, "As I finish this book in August 2014, Israel launches an air and ground attack on Gaza that kills more than 2,000 Palestinians, and a police officer shoots and kills 18-year-old Mike Brown, whose hands are in the air, in Ferguson, Missouri. Not much has changed. I presume we can all see that. But it is not simply that not much has changed, but that things are worse now because the death is still being disavowed. The police stay killing. Israel continues its genocidal campaign. Still, we have women of color feminism. We have coalition and mass mobilization. I, for one, have found a lot of direction in returning to Hong's work this past week in anticipation of her lecture today. Her insights are as incisive now as they were at publication. There is, as she explains, quote, "the mobilization of mourning as a disciplining apparatus of nationalism, the wielding of affects of fear and terror to legitimate abandonment, the bad faith offer of reproductive respectability in exchange for forgetting the connections between the modes of enslavement of the past and of the present, or the siren song of excellence that masks the university's violences," end quote. To imagine a different future, there is, as I've learned from Hong, a prerequisite, and that is attending to the relationship between our lives and others' deaths. Her talk is entitled How to Have Solidarity with a Ghost, Asian American Feminist Digital Cultures. Please join me in giving a warm, warm welcome to Grace Kyung-Wong Hong.
Okay, So my mic's on? Yeah? Okay. Well, my goodness, thank you. Thank you so much, Anna, for that gracious, generous, just amazing introduction. I want to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the unceded ancestral and present-day lands of the Shakori and Catawba peoples. So, many thanks to Jen Nash for inviting me to present to you today, and gratitude to Julie Winmore and Barbara Ofususumua and all the others without whose labors I would not be standing here. And thank you to you all for being here with us. So let me start with a passage from A Glossary of Haunting. I am a becoming specter, haunting and haunted, a future ghost, a stain. So in this presentation, I read Eve Tuck and C. Ree's 2013 piece, A Glossary of Haunting, alongside Chisato Hughes's 2022 documentary short film, Many Moons, to reflect on our political impossibilities currently. A Glossary of Haunting, a collaborative piece by two feminist theorists, written in the first person singular, is a text that ruminates on settler violence, horror, and the impossibility of justice and resolution through the deranging of a colonial form, the glossary, and its conventions of taxonomic order as a way of fixing meaning. Many Moons, the film, which explicitly uses A Glossary of Haunting as its feminist theory, traces the mass expulsion of Chinese laborers in 1885 from Eureka County at the northernmost edge of California, where the filmmaker grew up. In putting these texts in relation, I encounter ghosts who warn against the dangers of historical recovery, humanitarian governance, and archival research as extractivist practice. They direct me instead to kinship, care, and relationality as methodologies. In return, I meditate on ceremony and ceiling tiles. So let me start then with Many Moons. This film equivocally searches for the so-called last Chinaman of Humboldt, and Humboldt is the largest town in Eureka County. So this last Chinaman of Humboldt, Charlie Moon, was the one person allowed by his benevolent white settler employers to remain in the wake of the expulsion because of his industrious nature, or that's how the story goes. Moon married a Cholula woman and lived on the Hoopa Reservation. Their descendants materialize a history of resilience in the face of intertwined but incommensurate histories of extermination and expulsion. At the same time, Many Moons ambivalently grapples with Moon's mythologization, wielded as evidence of white benevolence on the one hand, and of the importance of Chinese American historical recovery on the other. Through the framing convention of a conversation with the ghost, in conversation with and in reference to A Glossary of Haunting, the film examines Moon as a figure for other Chinese people who also eluded expulsion and thus, by necessity, must exist in the historical record only as traces and fragments, if at all. Rather than approaching this record in the vein of historical recovery as a means to establish Chinese American presence in the face of erasure and expulsion, Many Moons looks for these ghosts in order to look after them, a gesture of mutual care and of relationality beyond recognition, in a modality not unlike Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, that is, an approach to the archive that provides a way to, quote, tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling, end quote, and that's from Hartman. This ostensible documentary is populated by ghosts, either as translucent figures standing, sitting, or walking through contemporary scenes, or as a voice speaking back to Hughes via script laid over the sounds and scenes of the Eureka County landscape. So, okay. All right. If history needs a face, if photographs suggest proof, how to rekindle scorched earth, how a supper of smoke. The subjunctive tense and querying tenor of these lines, written in a font developed from Hughes's deceased grandfather's handwriting, raises the idea of historical recovery and archival evidence, but only to gesture to what has been destroyed, scorched earth and smoke. If photographs suggest proof, the ghost postulates. And of course, photography does have an overdetermined claim to truth, in no small part established through the deployment of photography as a means of visual identification in the service of state surveillance. Photographs appended to immigration papers, for instance, are one of the few places where 19th century Asian migrant history has a face. Rather than historical recovery, then, ghosts serve as figures for what Tuck and Reed term the, quote, disturbance of certainty, end quote. The first scene set in the present day features Humboldt resident Darrell Chin, deftly cooking in his small, cluttered kitchen. As a later transplant to Humboldt, Chin is not directly related to Moon or any of the earlier wave of Chinese migrants, yet his scenes underscore how his experiences were shaped by the expulsion. We hear Hughes, who goes by they, them, remarking that they remember Chin from childhood, quote, because you were Asian, end quote. Subsequent shots of texts from newspapers document the expulsion of 1885 and the exclusion of Asians from Eureka County for the next 60 years. Chin was so memorable for Hughes, it turns out, not by accident, but by dint of an act of white supremacist violence that Hughes, as they observes in a later scene, was never even aware of growing up. This reference to the exceptionality of Asian people in Humboldt haunts the next conversation with another resident, Ali Ong Lee. Her segment starts with Ong Lee in her kitchen, asking Hughes, "Are you sure you're not hungry or anything?" And then moves to her describing other, earlier gestures of care. "I would see you walk to school," and that's Ong Lee. Hughes, "Really?" Ong Lee, "Yeah, on Old Arcata Road and then Bayside Road, right?" "Yep, I would see you." "There are kids I see. They grow up here, and you just watch them from a distance. I feel like I'm connected to them. I look after them." So in distinguishing looking for and looking after, I follow Kara Keeling in her analysis of the 2005 documentary film, The Aggressives, which follows a group of masculine-presenting people, mainly Black, in the drag ball subculture in New York. One of the people featured in this film, whom Keeling declines to even fully name, referring to them only as M, joins the military only to go AWOL after the invasion of Iraq. Keeling asks, quote, "Given that M's disappearance from the film's mise-en-scène is a form of resistance and survival, what are the ethical implications of looking for M?" End quote. Especially, as Keeling reminds us, going AWOL is criminalized, an offense punishable by court-martial. Keeling continues, quote, "While the military and its police might look for M or attempt to recognize M in a specific space, they will not look after M in either sense of that phrase. I may not be the only one looking for M, and in large part because of this, my admittedly problematic interests here have more to do with keeping M present but absent than with locating M in time or space, end quote. While Ong Lee never explicitly explains what motivates her to look after some of the children growing up there, the earlier discussion of Hughes remembering Chin because of the rarity of his Asianness hangs over this scene, conjuring an image of Hughes, exceptionally visible as an Asian child walking through Humboldt, and of Ong Lee's careful gaze following them. If the gesture that Keeling makes toward looking after M is to keep them present but absent, Minnie Moon's likewise looks after Charlie Moon. Ong Lee's practice of watching from a distance in order to look after them and her feeling of being connected to them becomes Hughes's methodology in this film, as they dig further into the archives and track down Moon's descendants in an attempt to understand this extraordinary man and the terrible violence that he apparently singularly survived. The film consistently emphasizes the violences that underlie historical erasure. Yet, as the film delves into the story of Charlie Moon, it becomes necessary to weigh those dangers against the growing realization that some connections cannot or should not be made, and that the desire to know and to recover has the potential to become a secondary violence. Subsequent frames provide background context in ways that are familiar to those accustomed to historical documentaries, using the words and images of archival documents, newspaper articles, journal entries, maps, photographs, to provide viewers with the context of the expulsion. An article called "When the Chinese Left Eureka" by Dale Thornberry recounts the, quote, friction and disorder that led to the, quote, accidental shooting of a city councilman, which crystallized public sentiment into a determination that the Chinese must go, end quote. Eureka County made good on this sentiment on February 7, 1885, by rounding up the Chinese population and forcing them onto 2 ships headed for San Francisco. And what happens to these folks after they get to San Francisco is unknown. At the time, as Lisa Lowe has precisely diagnosed, Asian migrant labor sublated the contradictions between 19th century state and capital, labor's need for differentiated laboring population, capital's need for differentiated laboring populations to suppress wages, create industrial reserves, and forestall labor solidarity on the one hand, and the nation-state's need to create a sense of homogeneity and nationalist identification on the other. Asian migrants recruited for work but ineligible for citizenship provided a way for both needs to be met. The vilification of Chinese migrant labor was central to this process. In Eureka County, the response was expulsion. One man is well known to have escaped this fate. Historical recovery starts with Clyde Moon, Charlie's great-grandson, describing the violence of white settler erasure. In a voiceover layered over a shot of a photograph labeled Fort Gaston, Hooper Reservation, of Native American girls in long uniform white dresses of a constraining style, posed shoulder to shoulder in rows in a familiar composition that conveys containment and bodily constraint, Clyde recounts that his mother went to a school where they, quote, beat her for talking Indian, end quote. Her answers to his questions about her childhood were always hookten, which means I don't know. Coupled with his observation that the Chinese were, quote, run out of town, end quote, Clyde's story grounds the film in the deep violence that subtends historical erasure. But these comments are followed by a story of resilience and generational connection. He shows a framed photo of his mother and father, noting that his father is descended from Charlie Moon. Hughes's voice off camera says, quote, your father does look like he's, and then trails off. having talked themselves into the awkward position of assigning racial designations to phenotype. Clyde interrupts by saying that his quarter Chinese father looks like Clyde's son George, and that his mother looks like his daughter. And of course, there's a lot to be said about the fact that Clyde says that the grandfather looks like the son, and the mother looks like the daughter instead of the other way around. He then tells his son to pass him a photo of Charlie and says, I don't know who Charlie Moon looks like. Charlie Moon, I guess. Charlie Moon in this photograph certainly does fit his description. Moon stands posed before a background of well-tended greenery, holding what looks to be a hoe or a rake, smiling pleasantly, clad in a gray felt hat, black trousers with suspenders, and a white shirt that is immaculate despite the fact that he appears to be farming or gardening. This man absolutely looks the part of an industrious and likable character. In these scenes, we see many moons deploy recognizable documentary conventions. And inherent to the concept of the documentary is a social reform agenda. Filmmaker and theorist John Grierson, who coined the term documentary in 1926, defined a documentary film as illuminating social problems so as to alleviate human suffering, rather than as a means of expressing aesthetic or artistic genius. From its beginnings, quote, documentary's privileged connection with the real, end quote, as Pooja Rangan observes, was undergirded by a belief that, quote, documentary works on behalf of disenfranchised people by giving voice to the voiceless, end quote. She thus describes the truth effects of documentary, which, quote, invokes its status as actuality rather than creative artifact to guarantee the humanity of the dehumanized subjects who deploy them, end quote. So the humanitarian role of such documentaries is not negligible, but are central to modern ways in which the human is constituted through what Tuck and Rhee call making killable. They write, making killable as a way of making subhuman, of transforming beings into masses that can be produced and destroyed, another form of empire's mass production, end quote. So Neda Tanasaski's work help us understand the centrality of humanitarianism in justifying empire's murderous technologies in the current moment. She emphasizes the importance of visual media, in particular the ostensibly unmediated truth effects of photojournalism, in establishing a new mode of empire in the post-World War II era through the refortification of not only the United States, but of US militarism as humanitarian exemplar. Tanasaski documents how US reaction to images of Vietnamese suffering and death in Vietnam War era photojournalism is understood as proof of the US's ability to engage in a moral reckoning with its own violence, attributing domestic anti-war sentiment to the ubiquity of these images, as indicated by now sort of commonplace and taken for granted description as the Vietnam War as the first televised war that brought war into the living rooms of Americans. Such narratives, quote, inscribe the failures of the Vietnam War as the condition of possibility for the emergence of the US nation as humanitarian, end quote. And that's Tanasaski again. Recognition of its own violence, its inhumanity, allows the US to narrate itself as humanitarian, in other words. In this way, as Diane Million notes, quote, the rise of a global human rights and humanitarianism after World War II reconfigured liberalism's racial orders. It did not reform or erase them, end quote. Rangan's critique of the imbrication of social documentary and humanitarianism is all the more devastating in this context. She argues that participatory documentary in particular reconsolidates the very terms of the human not by excluding, but by inviting those who have previously been foreclosed from that category. So documentary social justice claims, she writes, are, quote, most insidious when it is employed by disenfranchised subjects representing themselves, end quote. In her study, Rengen turns her attention to participatory documentary projects that put cameras in the hands of amateurs and outsiders, children of sex workers in Calcutta, victims of natural disasters, nonverbal autistics, and elephants at a sanctuary, to argue that their supposedly unstudied and raw, in quotes, capture of footage are intrinsic to these documentaries' claims of, quote, freedom from the defilement of mediation, end quote. So the unlikely auteurs of Rengen's study do have important differences, from the filmmaker behind Many Moons. So unlike the ostensibly amateur status of the participants in participatory documentary, Hughes holds an MFA in social documentary from UC Santa Cruz. Many Moons is their thesis film, and has built a career as a professional filmmaker and videographer. Yet Rengen's argument hinges on how these participants are recruited by tropes and narratives that prioritize legibility within conventional terms of the human, demonstrating the limits of the category of the amateur as an indication of ideological or epistemological difference. At the same time, the founding rationale of much of Asian American independent and nonprofit film, that is, the social justice project of Asian Americans taking control of the camera, representing ourselves rather than being represented, telling our stories. So this founding rationale replicates the logic of participatory documentary. A substantial genre of Asian American documentary filmmaking prioritizes historical preservation and recovery as a means to challenge historical erasure. That is to say, it frames itself as giving voice to a once silenced and voiceless community. So an example of this is a recent 5-part PBS documentary series, Asian Americans, which I think sort of is the epitome of this genre. So Asian Americans, described by the PBS tagline as, quote, a new lens on US history and the ongoing role that Asian Americans have played in shaping the nation's story, end quote, is directed by Renee Tajma Pena, who is my colleague at UCLA and former faculty in the social documentary program from which Hughes received their MFA. Destined from the start to be assigned in many a high school history class during Asian American Heritage Month, Asian Americans makes claim to comprehensiveness and coherence in ways that harnesses the impulses of independent film, which is where Renee Tajma Pena came up through, into the linear narrative historical documentary format familiar to PBS audiences everywhere, an effective, impressive, and monumental work, how Asian American historical recovery is shaped and framed by the multicultural rehabilitation of US empire. Many Moons does not discount the political necessity of historical recovery. Rather, it suggests that simply revealing past violence does not foreclose, but rather makes possible present-day operations of what Tuck and Rhee have called making killable. These operations, as Tanasowski's analysis demonstrates, are entirely predicated on the claiming of imperialist morality through the acknowledgement rather than erasure of wrongs, although such wrongs are always understood as past. This is the structure of feeling of our moment, what Audra Simpson has termed the age of apology, and what Lisa Yonayama has called redress culture. As it turns out, finding evidence of Charlie Moon becomes more rather than less complicated as the film goes on, as we see in a subsequent scene with Clyde's nephew, Charlie's great-great-grandson Richard Moon. Richard debunks Clyde's claim, gesturing to the same photograph and insisting, "That's not him. That's just a Chinese man. My grandma Myrtle told us that." She said, "No, that ain't the picture of him, but they used it, and you see it in the newspaper. It's just, I don't know who that man is. Richard's revelation that Charlie Moon does not, in actuality, look like Charlie Moon underscores the treachery of official sources, the clear inaccuracy of the newspaper that ran the photo of just a Chinese man and called it Charlie. The film upends the narrative trajectory of historical erasure remedied by historical recovery that the Clyde Moon sequence might otherwise enable. Instead, the search for one unique person turns into a search for many. The search for many, in turn, implies further violence of many kinds and obliquely references even more that cannot or should not be explicitly named, until it becomes clear that the expulsion was not a singular extraordinary event, but rather the one legible moment in an ongoing structure of devastation and survival, capture and evasion. Musing that the name Charlie Moon might well have been used by a number of people to hide their resistance to expulsion and to provide cover for their existence in Eureka County, Hughes realizes that Charlie Moon was not the last Chinaman in Humboldt, but rather a figure for a set of survival practices of evasion and misdirection. Hughes, alongside Chin, Ong Lee, and others, set out to find traces of others in the archives. A census lists a Jackson Ames as Chinese. A newspaper account from the 1950s skeptically recounts local legends of 3 Chinese men having married into indigenous communities, one who might have been named William Bow. And then they find reference to a William Bow in the census. A reference in a book to, quote, China Mary, a woman with no legal first or last name, end quote, states that she resided in a hospital and was, quote, marked with syphilis in the census, end quote. Then there are those with no names at all, legal or otherwise, but only queerly evocative descriptions. For instance, in an 1883 newspaper article of, quote, a Chinaman in this city that has a strange and peculiar liking for flowers, end quote. Quote, have not heard what Judge Howard did with him, end quote, is, chillingly, all the information we are left with about his fate. A methodology required to unearth a practice is quite different from those already available to find people, particularly a practice of hiding that was invented by people for whom survival depended on not being found, so looking after rather than looking for. This methodology is also an ethical orientation, and both require a departure from conventional documentary form. In Many Moons, ghosts are the visual infiguration of an approach to historical memory, a figurative manifestation of what the historical record cannot represent, but also cannot extinguish. Ghosts thus represent a methodology for historical inquiry, a practice of reading the archive that looks for what is absented yet leaves a trace. So Many Moons literally depicts ghosts by layering footage of present-day Asian American residents of Humboldt, dressed in period-styled clothes and reenacting past residents over contemporary scenes. One participant asks if he can reenact the flower-loving man, calling him, quote, the man with no name, end quote. He haltingly imagines himself in the place of the man with no name, saying, I could see myself being kind of desperate in a situation, so, and then trailing off. But his ghostly figure clasps flowers behind his back in a later scene, a gesture of extravagance in the midst of desperation. The woman reading from the historical account of China Mary gets fitted for a costume. A ghostly and translucent figure of a woman, perhaps China Mary herself, sews companionably as Ong Lee paints in the background. Working in the tense of the subjunctive, Many Moons calls up what Lisa Lowe has described as, quote, the past conditional temporality of what could have been, end quote. In the imagination of this film, the man with no name gets his flowers, and China Mary is not alone in the state hospital getting treatment for syphilis, but is accompanied in her work. In the face of historical erasure, for which historical recovery is not adequate compensation, but rather its accomplice, there is haunting, or what Tuck and Rhee call, quote, the relentless remembering and reminding that will not be appeased by settler society's assurances of innocence and reconciliation, end quote. Another description of haunting might be, quote, a rupture from within history that also breaks from history, end quote, which is Kara Keeling's words. A rupture that blasts the past out of its fixed meaning and, as Walter Benjamin urges, quote, attempts to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it, end quote. This alternative historical methodology becomes necessary in the face of the danger of archival research as extraction. Tuck and Rhee reckon with the horrific fury of the ghost in the films that they read. Hughes's ghost is less furious than suspicious, cautious, and untrusting, and rightly so. By what right do we seek to know the ghost? For what purpose? The ghost asks, how the living come to me with questions, if my image is convenient or comforting or complicit, if I am easily made complicit in your project, how am I remembered? When Saidiya Hartman went to the archive in search of Venus, she was afraid she would write a romance. To want to know the ghost is to risk wanting to be declarative rather than subjunctive, to land on the side of those who settled, those who expelled. Quote, monsters show up when they are denied, yet there is no understanding the monster, claim Tuck and Rhee. If they chose to evade, to hide, to elude surveillance, to be fugitive, who are we to second guess that choice? Yet, Tuck and Rhee reply, decolonization means attending to ghosts. While Charlie Moon and others evaded for the purposes of protection, their disappearance from state official memory threatens to separate them from those who might want to claim them as kin and to care for them. When violence takes our kin from us, we long for them. Hartman writes, loss gives rise to longing. Or perhaps, and also, it's the other way around. We know them as kin when we feel their absence as loss. We, quote, choose our ancestors, end quote, as Raymond Williams put it, when we are formed by our longing for them. If that's the case, who are our kin? Whom can we claim? And why would we, and why now? When asking what justifies our haunting of them, we might also ask the reverse. What makes them haunt us? Benjamin famously described how the past, quote, flashes up at a moment of danger, end quote, writing that in such moments, quote, even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, end quote. What is our present danger that makes the ghost return and that compels us to return to them? What brings us to contemplate then might be the ways in which such pasts are being invoked now. Something called anti-Asian hate, which too easily lends itself to being called anti-Asian hate crime, has been very much too much the way we've been visible of late. For instance, US-based organization Stop AAPI Hate drew national attention in 2020 by reporting a steep rise in acts of anti-Asian violence, attributing this increase in large part to racist COVID-19 conspiracy theories. This discourse rose to a fever pitch in the wake of the brutal murders of 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian immigrant women workers at massage businesses in Atlanta, Georgia, in March of 2021. The containment and redirection of the complex affective responses to violence on the part of Asian Americans into narratives of victimization, injury, and ressentiment has been harrowing, if not particularly surprising to watch. A vital component of such affective management is the insistence on an unbroken line from the exclusions, expulsions, incarcerations, and mass lynchings of Asian immigrants in years past to the beatings and murders of the present. Calling attention to anti-Asian violence serves the purposes of social justice for Asian Americans, we are told. For Tuck and Rhee, quote, "The promise of social justice sometimes rings false, smells consumptive, like another manifest destiny," end quote. The progressive temporality of social justice in the mobilization around something called anti-Asian hate, like another manifest destiny, is carceral, sentimental, and settler. Stop AAPI hate is a relatively minor formation, in my view, but the explanatory power of anti-Asian hate aligns with the mode of US settler empire that expresses itself as white sentimentality and white benevolence. In other words, it activates a humanitarian affect that weaponizes care. There are many differences between the violence of the past and that of the present. One very important one is that today, there is a structure for remedying that violence that reestablishes violence. Quote, "rights in the form of care that never disrupts the violence of the racial capitalist settler order," end quote, as Millian precisely notes. She goes on to write, "Liberal humanitarianism lets indigenous death exist where it cannot heal us, incorporate us, or erase us through other means," end quote. How we are hated now certainly has some relevance to how we were hated then, but how might we make such connections without refortifying the humanitarian affect of white settler sentiment and benevolence? So again, turning to Tuck and Rhee. Settler colonialism is the management of those who have been made killable once and future ghosts. End quote. Settler colonialism is the machine that makes killable, first and foremost as a mode of counter-sovereignty against the indigenous. But those dislocated and relocated by the machinations of coercion or consent are not exempt from such management. What have been the contours of Asianness made killable? There isn't an explicit answer to this question in a glossary of haunting, but I found something there nonetheless, and you can tell me if I'm just making things up, which might be a good thing or a bad thing. I found it in ceiling tiles, of all things. Tuck and Rhee are obsessed with ceiling tiles, the kind that form drop ceilings in businesses and office buildings. They write, quote, "I never see them, but rather I sense them," end quote. Keeling calls what, quote, "cannot be seen or understood, but is nevertheless present, affect," end quote, a felt presence of the unknowable. Apparently, ceiling tiles are that. They cannot be seen, only sensed, because they're not meant to be seen. Tuck and Rhee incorporate ceiling tiles in their arts practice, photographing their leaks and stains in public buildings, creating drop ceiling installations that slowly drip water and eventually abruptly collapse. They write, quote, "Designed to look like a reassuring solid plane, they are in fact an aluminum grid filled with lightweight tiles, suspended with wires here and there. Their cheap, disposable, modular, flexible design was a breakthrough and ensured their spread throughout building today, and in many ways their invisibility. The tiles' swappable nature is also touted as a low-cost strategy for hiding leaks," end quote. Everywhere yet invisible, necessary but aesthetically so, for reassurance and convenience rather than structural integrity. Cheap, superficial, replaceable. 19th century Chinese diasporic labor, which Charlie Moon provided his benevolent bosses, had a cheap, disposable, modular, flexible design. Imported to the US West Coast in the service of manifest destiny, to the Caribbean as a transition from enslaved to quote-unquote free labor, Chinese labor filled in the cracks of empire, smoothed its edges, allowed it to go on a day at a time, even as it threatened constantly to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. In the present, Asianness remains globally flexible, associated somehow with both teeming masses and elite professionals, diligent overworkers and cost-cutting counterfeits, cheap labor, and the crazy rich. Asianness continues to have what Feng-Mei Heberer describes as, quote, a seamlessly accessible representational function, an on-demand figure set up to serve, the expectation to be readily available for show, ultimately operates on a demand for superfluousness. Something is always already programmed to go, end quote. Seen or not, always in the background, ready to serve, ready to disappear wherever convenient. Heberer calls this, quote, Asians on demand, end quote, the racial equivalent to streaming. Asianness as a productive visual category on behalf of the neoliberal market. Yet in the forms and tropes of Asian diasporic independent film, Heberer finds the equivalent of Tuck and Rhee's, quote, ceilings which leak, ceilings which stare back, ceilings which crash down, end quote. Unruly Asianness, failed Asianness. Charlie Moon's industriousness and likability turns out to enable fugitivity as well as exploitation. Quote, they are specters that collapse time, rendering empire's foundational past impossible to erase from the national present. They are a source of persistent unease. This is what suspended ceilings try to hide, but only uncover, end quote. I'm arguing then that Many Moons stares back and crashes down. Rather than raising the specter of white hate as a source of Asian American injury for which white benevolence is the cure, the film speculates that Chinese migrants might have exploited the illusions of white benevolence narratives to elude capture and containment. Taking recourse in humanitarian logics is to insist on one's inclusion into the category of the not made killable, which of course only exists because others are made killable. Many Moons differently resurrects the connection between then and now in ways that don't rely on recourse to the human and the humanitarian. Instead of being more recognizable as human, the ghost suggests, be elusive, be fugitive, be monstrous. How might we approach the dead in ways that respect their monstrosity? If we resurrect the dead in order to make them tell a story we want, we are approaching them as resources meant to be extracted. Instead, we might treat the dead as relations, as kin, through an ethos of relationality. Here, I rely on a long tradition of indigenous feminist theorizations of relationality. Millian describes indigenous relationality as, quote, cohesive peoples who act from our own sacred relations, the practices that produce life for ourselves and all the entities that we are reciprocally responsible to, end quote. Lauren Tynan attests that relationality is predicated on country, a term used by Aboriginal communities in what is now called Australia, in distinction to the settler category of land. Tynan writes that, quote, country sits at the heart of coming to know and understand relationality as it is the web that connects humans to a system of lore/law and knowledge that can never be human-centric, end quote. For Tynan, relationality is the obverse of extraction, and it is difficult to do research, archival or otherwise, in a relational way, since, quote, research itself tends to be extractive, end quote, and, quote, extractivism sits at the core of colonialism. In contrast, indigenous epistemologies are based on relationality. Relationality is how the world is known. Repudiating the narrative of humanitarianism and the lure of inclusion into the category of the human through historical recovery, Many Moons instead suggest accompaniment rather than knowing, caring for rather than taking from, looking after rather than looking for, as a way to claim kinship. Millian writes, quote, caring builds the trust that creates communities, kinships between responsible, respectful, connected, purposeful beings, end quote. The film ends as it began, with a scene of cooking, but this time with images of hands cutting fruit and cleaning fish. The lovingly prepared dishes are placed on an altar lit with incense. How a supper of smoke, around which ghostly figures congregate and partake. The scene explicitly represents the Chinese practice of ancestor offerings and might also be said to evoke indigenous, specifically Anishinaabe, traditions of the ghost meal and the spirit plate, although much less explicitly so. Tuck and Ree write that, quote, ceremony is the only resolution, quote, and Tynan attests that, quote, relationality is kinship. A relational approach does not attempt to segment and classify the world, but create stronger relationality or ceremony between entities, end quote. Huge stages a ceremony of ancestor offering not for the sake of appeasement or closure, but rather to seek kinship through offering rather than extraction, through fabulation rather than through claims to transparency, fidelity, and truth. It is in the realm of culture where other possibilities obtain, in which the response to racist and settler colonial violence is not claims to legitimacy, but rather is disappearance and refusal, not to insist on historical presence so as to legitimate claims or identities in the present, but rather to imagine a relationality of feeding and care, looking after. Feeding the ghost, enabling the conviviality of the dead, bringing those who have been alone, isolated from each other and from us, together. Through the gesture of joining rather than vanquishing the ghost, Many Moons and a Glossary of Haunting leave us with the possibility of an otherwise relationality, haunting as care in a landscape populated with ghosts. Thank you.